This is my true story. I built my home with my own hands, brick by brick, working decades to give my family comfort and shelter. I believed a house was more than walls. It was the heart of family, built on respect and love. But one day, everything changed. My son, without hesitation, told me, "Don't argue with my wife in her house, as if the home I built was not mine." That moment broke something inside me. Before I tell you what happened next, please share where you're watching from now and subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent decades working tirelessly to build the home where my family lived, brick by brick, dream by dream. Every morning before the sun rose, I would wake, lace my boots, and head to work. I carried beams, mixed cement, fixed walls, and painted rooms with my own hands because I believed that no one could give my family a home as fully as I could. I sacrificed comfort, rest, and even my health so they could have a place to call safe. The house was not just a structure to me. It was a symbol of all I had given. Over the years, the home became the heart of my life. Every corner held memories, my wife's laughter echoing in the kitchen, my children playing in the yard, birthdays celebrated in the living room, evenings spent under the warm glow of lamps. I kept this place alive with care, repairing roofs in storms, fixing broken windows, and repainting walls when time left them weary. I never counted the hours or the sweat. To me, these were investments in my family's future. I saved every penny I could, not for myself, but so the house could be a home for my children long after I was gone. I turned down small comforts for myself, gave up weekends, and worked extra hours. Sometimes I ate less so they could eat more. I believed that a home was not just about shelter, but about the comfort and dignity it gave. I thought that my sacrifices would be respected, and that my children would understand what I had done for them. For years, I told myself that respect was the foundation of family life. I believed that love without respect was like a house without walls, fragile, open to collapse. I dreamed that my children would honor the house I built, not because it was valuable, but because it was a testament to years of work, love, and perseverance. I imagined them walking through those doors with gratitude, keeping the home as a symbol of family and unity. But over time, I began to notice changes. My wife started treating the house more as her own domain than ours. She redecorated without consulting me, spent on luxuries without asking, and slowly began to claim ownership in subtle ways. My son, instead of understanding the history of the house, took her side. He began dismissing my words, saying I was too old to understand modern living. Arguments became sharper, voices louder, respect thinner. My place in my own home was quietly slipping away. I endured this quietly, believing patience and love would bring respect back. I told myself that families have seasons, and this was one of silence and endurance. I thought my years of sacrifice would speak louder than arguments. But one afternoon, that quiet patience broke. My son's words cut deeper than any hammer or chisel ever could, and my heart understood something I had avoided for too long. Respect was gone. My home, built with decades of sweat, was no longer mine in spirit. The day my son shouted, "Don't argue with my wife in her house," it was more than a remark. It was a wound that split my soul. I stood there stunned, hearing my life's work stripped away in an instant. Every brick I had placed, every nail I had hammered, every hour I had spent, ignored. My home was no longer a place of mutual respect. It had become a battlefield where my voice was silenced. It was then I realized that sacrifice alone does not guarantee respect. Respect must be demanded, protected, and proven. This realization weighed on me heavily. I could no longer stay silent. The home I built was not just about walls and rooms. It was my legacy. My wife and son might claim it differently, but I knew its truth. That home was mine by right, by sweat, and by heart. I understood I had to act, not with anger, but with proof. I needed them to see that a house without respect is no home at all, and that the truth of ownership cannot be silenced by forceful words. I decided then that I would defend the house quietly but firmly. I would not shout or create conflict. Instead, I would let facts speak louder than voices. My sacrifice, my years of toil, and my rightful ownership were facts no one could deny once shown. This decision was not born of revenge, but of dignity, a need to protect what I had given my life to build. I knew it would be a moment that would change everything for my son, my wife, and the house we lived in. The house stood as more than wood and stone. It was the embodiment of my life's work, a silent witness to decades of sacrifice. And now, I knew I had to make its story heard, not with noise, but with proof. I wanted them to understand that respect comes from acknowledging what others have built for you, and that ownership is not just possession, it is trust and honor. This belief became my resolve, shaping the quiet plan I would soon put into motion. In truth, I never sought conflict. I had built this home for love, for family, for peace. But the moment I realized my son no longer respected that, I knew something had to change. Not for me alone, but for the legacy of what this home represented. Respect could not be given away casually. It must be earned and defended. That day, I chose to defend it not with anger, but with the quiet power of truth. Over the years, I began to notice small changes that grew louder with time. At first, they were tiny, almost easy to overlook. My wife rearranging the furniture without asking, spending on things without discussion, choosing colors for the walls without considering my opinion. At first, I told myself it was normal. Maybe she simply wanted a fresh change. But soon, those small actions began to carry a weight of their own. It became clear that these were not innocent choices, but subtle shifts that chipped away at my place in my own home. My son, who once walked beside me with pride, began to treat my voice like an echo no longer worth hearing. He started ignoring my advice and cutting me out of decisions about the house I had built. When I spoke of repairs that were needed, he dismissed my words as outdated. He said I was too old to understand the way things should be done now. That stung more than anything because my age was not a weakness. It was the proof of decades of hard work, sweat, and sacrifice poured into that home. Even at family gatherings, his words grew sharper. What had been gentle disagreement became mockery. He laughed at my concerns, turning them into jokes. He spoke over me, as though my years of experience counted for nothing. I could see my wife smiling at his comments, agreeing silently. They seemed to share a growing bond in sidelining me, and the house itself became a stage for their unity. Their laughter was like nails being driven into my pride, each one a reminder that respect was slipping away. The disrespect was not only in words, but in actions. My things began to be treated carelessly. Belongings I had cherished for years, simple things, often gifts, items tied to memories, began to disappear or be discarded without explanation. A chair I had built myself was left outside to weather the rain. Old photographs of family moments were shoved into drawers without care. I began to feel invisible in the house I had built. My years of work and memories seemed to matter less with each passing day. At first, I endured quietly, convincing myself patience would bring change. I told myself this was just a phase, that my wife and son would remember the meaning of respect. I kept silent at the table, listening to them speak over me. I smiled when they mocked me in public, thinking that pride might be preserved by not showing my pain. I held on to the hope that love could still overcome disrespect. But beneath my silence, a quiet storm was building. I was gathering the weight of my years, the hurt of being ignored, and the truth that my home was no longer my own in spirit. What hurt most was the way they redefined my place in the home. I became an outsider in my own house, as though my years of sacrifice had been erased. The warmth that once filled those walls disappeared. Conversations in the kitchen became whispers about me rather than with me. My input was no longer sought. Even when I tried to contribute, it was brushed off with a wave of the hand or a quick remark about my being out of touch. The house that was once a shared haven became a territory where I was unwelcome in decision-making. It was not just a loss of control, it was a loss of dignity. I began to see my own home as a place where my voice no longer mattered. The man who had poured his life into building the house felt stripped of his rightful place. Respect, once a given in our family, was now replaced with mockery and disregard. That shift stung deeper than any broken thing or insult because it touched the core of what I had always believed. That respect was the foundation of family life. This gradual erosion of respect reached a breaking point over arguments. What had been gentle disagreements became louder confrontations. My wife began to claim the right to speak for the home, and my son took her side, not mine. They did not see it as betrayal, but I knew the truth. They were erasing me. I tried to speak calmly, to remind them of the years, the sweat, the nights I had spent repairing the roof, saving for repairs, making sure we had a home worth living in. But they spoke louder, not because they had truth, but because they wished to silence me. My patience began to run thin. I realized that silence no longer worked as a shield. Silence was becoming acceptance. The home I had built, the refuge for my family, was turning into a place where my voice was drowned out. I could feel my authority slipping away, not because it was challenged once or twice, but because it was chipped away steadily over time. The disrespect was not sudden. It was a slow erosion that led to a moment I would never forget. That moment came one afternoon, in a heated argument I will always remember. I had spoken softly, trying to explain something about the maintenance of the house, something important to me. My son interrupted sharply, with a tone that carried not just disagreement, but contempt. The argument grew louder, voices clashing. Then, with a cold laugh, he said words that pierced deeper than any blow. "Don't argue with my wife in her house." Those words stayed with me. They were not just an insult, they were a declaration. They stripped away everything I had built in silence over decades. The house I had lived in, worked for, and protected was no longer mine in their eyes. It was hers, and they had sided against me. I stood there stunned, unable to answer in that moment, because I knew words would not be enough. Respect could not be demanded in shouting. It had to be proven. That night, I sat alone, turning over in my mind all the small signs of disrespect I had endured, all the laughter, all the dismissals. I thought of the years I had devoted to the home, the sacrifices made without complaint. I realized that the disrespect was not just about the house, it was about me, about my place in my family, about the values I had tried to teach. And I understood that if I wanted respect restored, I could not do it with shouting or confrontation. I needed something quieter, something undeniable. I began to consider my options. I knew my home was legally mine, but that was not enough. I needed a way to make the truth clear to them without escalating the conflict. I decided that I would speak not with anger, but with proof. Ownership was not just about papers, it was about showing them the truth, and I would do it calmly so that they could not turn it into another argument, but would have to face it with silence. The signs of disrespect had been building for years. They had eroded the foundation of my home and my place within it. Now I knew that silence was no longer enough. I needed to make them understand, not with my voice, but with undeniable truth. And in that resolve, I found a clarity I had not felt in years. I was ready to act, not out of revenge, but out of a need to protect what I had built and to restore respect for myself and the home I had given my life to. It happened on an afternoon that began like any other, but the air in the house already felt heavy. I was in the living room, repairing a small shelf I had made myself years ago. The wood was worn, the nails slightly loose, but it was more than just furniture to me. It was part of my history, part of the home I had built with my own hands. My wife came in, speaking sharply about something trivial, and before I could answer, my son joined in with a raised voice. The small disagreement quickly became a storm, each word carrying more weight than the last. At first, I tried to stay calm. I spoke quietly, explaining why certain repairs were important. I reminded them of the years I had worked to make the house safe and welcoming. I spoke not to win an argument, but because I believed that truth and history should matter. But my words were met with laughter, interruptions, and dismissals. My wife, standing beside him, crossed her arms and shook her head as if my voice had no value. My son, with a look of irritation, raised his voice to drown me out. That moment was not about the shelf anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been building for years: control, respect, and ownership. The words escalated quickly. My son's tone was not only sharp, but mocking. He questioned my knowledge, my experience, even my right to speak in the home. His laughter was not soft, it was loud and cutting. My wife joined in, chuckling at his remarks, and their laughter echoed in the living room. It was not laughter of joy, but of superiority. They treated me as if I were a man past his time, as if my opinions were relics of a life they no longer cared to honor. That laughter burned more than any insult because it carried the weight of dismissal, the final proof that they no longer respected me as the head of the household. Then came the words that changed everything. In a tone sharp with defiance, my son shouted across the room, "Don't argue with my wife in her house." It was as if a blade had cut through the air, slicing away not only my voice, but the foundation of my home. I stood frozen. Those words echoed in my ears long after the argument ended. My wife smiled faintly, not with comfort, but with a strange satisfaction, and my son smirked, as if he had won something far greater than a quarrel. But I knew the truth. Those words were not just about the moment. They were about power. They were about telling me that in my own house, my voice no longer mattered. The moment my son said those words, I felt a deep ache in my chest. It was not just anger or humiliation, it was something heavier. It was the realization that respect, once given without question, had been stripped away through years of subtle dismissal and mockery. The home I had built, brick by brick, with sweat and sacrifice, was no longer recognized as mine in spirit. It had become hers in their eyes, and I was a guest in my own life. That thought burned within me far more than the noise of that heated argument. I did not answer him at once. Instead, I stood in silence, letting his words settle into the air between us. Silence was my shield that day. I knew that if I responded with anger, I would only feed the fire. And they wanted that fire. They wanted me to lose my temper so they could claim victory. So I stepped back, walked away from the room, and closed the door behind me. My heart pounded with a mixture of hurt and resolve. That night, I would sit alone and reflect on what had just happened. That evening, I sat quietly in my small study, staring at the worn chair where I had spent countless hours planning the life of my family. My hands rested on the arms of the chair, trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of years lived and the burden of betrayal. I thought about the house, every beam, every wall, every corner filled with the work of my hands. And I thought about the years of silence I had kept when disrespect grew quietly between us. Silence had been my choice before, but now I understood it had allowed disrespect to grow stronger. I thought about my son's laughter and my wife's approval. They were not just laughing at my words, they were laughing at my place in their lives. The truth hurt. They no longer saw me as the man who had given them a home, who had kept them safe, who had provided for them through hardship. They saw me as an obstacle, someone whose voice could be ignored. That thought stung deeply, deeper than the argument itself. Respect was not about shouting louder than someone else. It was about recognizing the value of another's life and work. And theirs had been taken away in those moments. The breaking point was not in that argument alone. It was in the years of small dismissals leading up to it. The broken trust, the absence of acknowledgement for what I had given, and the quiet removal of my voice from my home had been building silently. That afternoon was merely the eruption of something long simmering beneath the surface. And now, standing in the quiet after the storm, I knew I could no longer let it go unanswered. That night, I thought of what I could do. I did not want another argument. I wanted a lesson they could never ignore. I wanted the truth to speak louder than anger, to stand clear before mockery and denial. I thought about ownership, not only in law, but in respect. And I knew I had the proof I needed. My silence until now had been my patience. But patience had limits. Respect was not restored by words alone. It required a moment of undeniable truth. And I began to form a plan in my mind. I decided then that I would act quietly, without shouting, without scenes. My answer would not be in anger, but in clarity. I would show them the truth of the home we lived in, the truth of who built it, who cared for it, and who owned it. That truth would be my voice. I would not demand respect through confrontation. I would make it so clear they could not ignore it. My silence in the argument would become the calm before the proof, and the proof would speak in a way that no laughter could erase. The heated argument had been a turning point. It was no longer about a disagreement over repairs or words. It was about something far greater: respect, legacy, and dignity. It was about standing up for what is yours without losing yourself to bitterness. That evening, I resolved that my next move would be decisive and quiet. I would reclaim my place in my own home, not by shouting louder, but by letting truth speak for itself. And in that resolve, I found something I had almost forgotten: the quiet strength of justice. That evening, after the heated argument, I sat quietly alone in my small study. The house was unusually silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy silence of wounds left unspoken. The air felt thick with the weight of what had happened, and the laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in my ears. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting on the worn wood of the armrests, and let my thoughts drift to the past, to all the years that had led to that moment. I thought about every brick in this house, every nail hammered in place, every wall I had painted with my own hands. This home was more than shelter. It was the symbol of a life of sacrifice. I had built it piece by piece, often at the expense of my own rest, my health, and even my dreams. Every evening I worked late, not for glory, but because I wanted my family to have a safe place to return to. I remembered the long nights after the children were asleep, working by the dim light of a lamp, my fingers aching, but my heart full of purpose. My mind wandered further back, to when this house was first ours. I remembered the day we got the keys, how we stood in front of the door, dreaming of years filled with laughter and warmth. I had pictured family dinners, children's birthdays, winters by the fire, and summers in the garden. I had imagined respect and love filling every room. And for years, it was just that. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. The laughter turned quiet, respect turned into dismissal, and the home became a battleground. I reflected deeply on that change. Respect is not given in a single moment. It is built slowly, over time, and it can fade just as quietly. I thought about my son's attitude in the past months, the way he spoke over me, the way my wife had stopped listening to my words. These were not sudden changes, but small shifts that had grown without my noticing. Silence, which I had thought was patience, had become complacency. I had allowed disrespect to grow because I believed that love and loyalty were unshakable. I had been wrong. The memory of my son's words that afternoon kept coming back to me, louder with each recollection. Don't argue with my wife in her house. It wasn't just the words, but the claim behind them, that my voice and my place no longer mattered. I could not forget the way they both looked at me after saying it, as if I were an outsider intruding on their domain. That moment stayed with me, a bitter reminder that the bonds of family could be broken quietly, not by grand acts, but by small dismissals. That truth hurt more than any fight I had ever faced. As I sat there in silence, I thought about dignity. I thought about how much of it I had given away in the years of keeping peace, in avoiding conflict for the sake of family. I realize now that I had confused silence with strength. Strength is not merely the ability to endure. Strength is the courage to stand when silence no longer serves the truth. My silence that day had not brought peace. It had allowed my voice to be erased. That realization settled over me like a weight, heavy yet clarifying. My mind drifted to the future. What should I do now? The answer came slowly, not as a rush of anger, but as a quiet certainty. I would not let this moment pass without teaching them something that could not be ignored. Not through shouting, but through undeniable truth. I would let them see the value of what had been given, the home that had been built with sweat and sacrifice. I knew that no argument, no loud voice, could restore respect unless it was backed by clarity they could not dispute. I thought about confrontation. Confrontation often leads to bitterness. I wanted something different, a resolution without bitterness. a statement without cruelty. My reflection turned toward the idea of proof. Proof of who built this home, proof of who owned it, proof of the years of dedication it had taken to make it ours. I knew I had the means to show them that respect is not given by force, but by truth. That truth would become my voice, and my silence until now would be the strength behind it. I remembered times when I had let my family's comfort take precedence over my own pride. I had chosen to avoid disputes to keep harmony, believing that love would protect respect. But now, I understood that respect needs to be safeguarded, and harmony without truth is fragile. That afternoon's argument had shown me that respect could be stripped away quietly, without a single battle cry. And so, in the quiet of that evening, I vowed not to let it happen again. My reflection was not filled with anger, but with clarity. I thought about the kind of lesson I wanted to give them, not one of revenge, but of undeniable truth. I wanted them to remember that day, not for the noise of the argument, but for the silent proof I would give them. Respect is not about proving who is louder. It is about showing who has built and held the foundation. And I knew the foundation of our home was built by my hands, my work, my sacrifice. That knowledge became my resolve. As the night grew deeper and the house quieter, I began to form a plan. I would not argue, I would not yell, I would not beg for recognition. Instead, I would prepare the truth. Ownership papers, photographs of the house under construction, receipts, and records of years spent building this home. All of it would speak louder than any argument. My silence would become the calm before their understanding, and the proof would be the voice that could not be denied. I thought about my son and wife, what they would feel when faced with that truth. Would they understand the depth of what they had dismissed? Would they remember the years of work and sacrifice that had been quietly built into the walls of this home? I did not know. What I did know was that I could no longer remain silent. Silence had cost me my respect, and now silence would be my choice no longer. I sat there long after the household had gone quiet, the air heavy with unspoken words. I understood then that the moment of reflection was not only about what had happened that afternoon, but about what I was about to do. My resolve became stronger. I would let truth speak in place of anger. I would let my silence turn into a statement they could not ignore. That night, in the quiet of my study, I found peace in knowing that my next step would not be retaliation, but clarity. The night after that argument, I lay awake in bed long after the house had quieted. My mind would not rest. The words my son had spoken echoed again and again. Don't argue with my wife in her house. Those words were not merely a statement. They were a claim, a challenge, and a dismissal of all I had given this family. I could not stop thinking about them. I thought about the years I had spent building not only a home, but a life for them. I thought about the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, the quiet nights, the hard labor, and the promises kept. All of it seemed to have vanished in a moment of disrespect. I realized then that this was not just a quarrel. This was a moment of reckoning, a turning point that demanded a decision that I could not postpone any longer. For days afterward, I moved through the house quietly, the air thick with tension I could not name aloud. I went about my chores, cooked my meals in silence, and avoided the living room where the argument had taken place. Every corner of the house reminded me of what had been lost. Not the structure itself, but the respect that had once filled it. I reflected deeply, wondering if I had been wrong to stay silent all those years, hoping for harmony. Silence had been my armor, but now it felt like a cage. I understood I could no longer hide behind it. I needed to act, but not in haste, not with anger. This required a plan rooted in quiet strength. That decision came to me slowly, almost as if it had been forming long before I recognized it. I would not confront them in anger. I would not shout or plead. Instead, I would show them the truth so clearly that words would become unnecessary. I needed proof, not of my feelings, but of the fact that this house, the foundation of our family, was built on my sacrifice. I wanted to reveal this truth in such a way that they could not ignore it, that it would rest forever in their minds. I wanted this to be a lesson that could not be dismissed or forgotten. I began that very morning by reaching out quietly to my lawyer. I did not speak to my son or my wife about it. There was no need for that yet. If anything, speaking too soon would diminish the impact. I wanted this to be deliberate, precise. I wanted the moment of revelation to carry weight. My lawyer listened patiently, and I explained that I needed to review the ownership documents for the house. I wanted to know clearly where the legal rights lay and whether my claim was indisputable. This was not about possession alone. It was about dignity and respect. I wanted to ensure my next move was unshakable. The lawyer assured me that the papers existed and that the house was indeed in my name. That confirmation filled me with a quiet resolve. I knew then that the truth was mine to present and that it could not be denied. I began to collect every document related to the house: purchase agreements, property deeds, mortgage papers, construction receipts, photographs of the building process, and even old letters that told the story of years spent creating this home. Each paper was a piece of the history I had lived and built for my family. They were proof not only of ownership, but of sacrifice, and I intended to use them. As I gathered these documents, my thoughts often drifted to how I would reveal them. It was not enough for me to simply say, "This is my house." I wanted a moment of undeniable truth. A moment where silence would fall and no argument could rise above the facts. I imagined the scene clearly, a family gathering where I calmly placed the papers before them, letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself. That vision became my plan. It was not revenge in its loudest form. It was quiet, deliberate, and powerful. It was truth standing in place of anger. While preparing, I also reflected on my emotions. I felt no rush of hatred toward my son or wife, but I did feel a steady determination. I wanted them to understand, not just to comply. This was not about winning an argument. It was about restoring a sense of respect that had been stripped away. I thought about the lessons I had learned in life, that dignity is not taken by force, but by quiet assertion, and that truth carries weight when presented without malice. My decision was rooted in these beliefs. I considered the risks. Would they respond with anger? Would my son dismiss the evidence? Would my wife call it a stunt? These questions lingered, but I knew the risk was worth taking. Silence had not protected me before. It had allowed disrespect to grow. Now, I chose to break that silence with something stronger, undeniable proof. I resolved to approach it calmly, without raising my voice, so that my action itself would be the lesson. During this time, I also found myself quietly preparing emotionally. I understood that once I revealed the truth, nothing would return to the way it had been. Respect would either be restored, or relationships would break entirely. I was prepared for both outcomes, but I was certain of one thing. I could no longer allow my voice to be drowned by the noise of disrespect. My silence had ended, and my decision to act would be the voice that could not be ignored. As I finalized my plan, I felt a strange mixture of peace and resolve. Peace because I was no longer trapped by silence, and resolve because I knew exactly what needed to be done. My decision was not born from anger, but from a quiet conviction that truth must be told. I knew the moment of revelation would be mine to choose, and I decided to choose it with patience and precision. This was not about proving who was right. It was about proving who had built, sacrificed, and protected the home we lived in. Finally, I resolved to wait for the right moment. The right moment was not a moment of confrontation, but a moment of clarity, when my son and wife would have no choice but to face the truth. I would not raise my voice, and I would not demand respect. Instead, I would present the facts and let silence carry the weight of my message. My decision was made, and with it, a sense of quiet determination settled in my heart. I knew I was about to change the course of our home forever. That night, as I lay in bed once more, I felt a calm unlike anything I had experienced since the argument. I was no longer consumed by hurt or frustration. My mind was clear and my resolve was firm. I had made my decision to speak not through anger, but through undeniable truth. My silence would be broken, not by noise, but by proof, and that decision would become my voice, louder and stronger than any argument my son or wife could ever raise. After I had made my decision, I knew that preparation was as important as the act itself. The moment I chose to reveal the truth would not be impulsive. It had to be deliberate, quiet, and undeniable. My plan was simple in its concept, but profound in its execution. I would let facts speak for themselves, not my emotions. Anger fades, but truth endures. I began by organizing every piece of evidence I had collected about the house. Every receipt, every document, every photograph was a brick in the foundation of my claim. They would not just prove ownership, but also remind them of the years of effort and sacrifice behind it. I printed copies of the house ownership documents, making sure they were clear and easy to read. I marked important dates and signatures so there would be no doubt. Next, I laid out photographs of the house during construction, myself standing on ladders, mixing cement, hammering wood, carrying bricks. Those pictures carried more weight than words. They told the story of decades of work, of sweat, and of hands that built a home from the ground up. These photographs would show them the physical reality of what had been done, beyond legal papers. They would show that this house was not just walls and a roof, but the result of a lifetime's labor. I also prepared a written statement. It was not meant to be read aloud in anger, but to accompany the documents and photos so that anyone who looked at them could understand my point. This statement explained the history of the house, the sacrifices I had made, and the significance of the home to me as a father. It was not a letter of blame, but a quiet assertion of truth. I wanted them to see this not as an attack, but as a lesson, a revelation that respect for the truth was more important than winning arguments. Choosing the moment for revelation was the next part of my plan. I did not want this to happen in haste or in anger. I waited for a family gathering, a time when everyone was together without distractions. This way, the truth could be presented in full presence, without interruptions. I thought about the timing carefully, when emotions would be visible, but not overpowering. I knew that in such a setting, silence after truth would be the loudest voice. I wanted them to feel the weight of the evidence, without me needing to speak too much. I rehearsed the moment quietly in my mind. I pictured myself calmly placing the papers and photographs on the table. I imagined the pause that would follow, the way silence would settle over them. I imagined their eyes shifting from me to the documents, the change in their expressions as the truth sank in. I knew there would be resistance, a quick dismissal or a defensive word, but I also knew that facts were not so easily erased. My plan relied on patience, not confrontation. I would not argue. I would present and wait. That was the strength of the plan. While preparing, I also thought about my own emotions. I reminded myself that this was not about revenge. It was about restoring dignity, about reclaiming respect in the face of disregard. I thought about the years of quiet sacrifice, the nights of hard work, and the moments of giving without asking for thanks. This was about making sure that those sacrifices were acknowledged, not in anger, but in truth. I wanted my son and wife to understand that respect was not given lightly, nor taken for granted. I also considered the possible reactions. My son might become defensive. My wife might attempt to silence me. But my plan accounted for this. I would remain calm. Calmness would be my shield. Calmness would be my voice. I believed that the truth, presented without emotion, had the power to pierce through denial more than any argument. My plan was built on that belief. I knew that in time, even they would see what I was showing them. Part of the plan also involved how I would leave the room afterward. I decided I would not engage in debate after presenting the truth. I would step back quietly, letting them digest the reality without my interference. This was intentional, to allow space for reflection rather than prolonging confrontation. I wanted them to remember the moment not as an argument, but as a revelation. I wanted silence to be the final statement, louder than any shouting could ever be. I thought of who else might witness this moment. Close relatives, perhaps a neighbor or two. People who knew the history of the house and my effort. Their silent presence would strengthen the truth of what I was presenting. It would be a quiet, shared acknowledgement that this was not merely a claim, but a reality rooted in years of sacrifice. My plan included this audience because truth becomes stronger when witnessed. Finally, I prepared myself mentally for the aftermath. I knew that once the truth was laid bare, relationships would change. Respect could be restored, or resentment could grow. That was not mine to control. My part was to speak the truth clearly, calmly, and without malice. Everything else would follow naturally. My plan was not to win an argument, but to plant a seed of respect that could grow in their hearts long after the moment had passed. As the day for the revelation approached, I felt a quiet resolve deep within me. The preparation had done its work. The papers were ready. The photographs were prepared. My statement was written. My heart was steady. I knew I was about to take a step that could not be undone. This was not an act of pride alone, but an act of dignity. My plan was not to shout louder than them, but to speak in a way that would last far longer than anger. That evening, before the family gathering, I placed the documents carefully in a folder and set them aside. I sat quietly, thinking about the weight of what was to come. My plan had been laid, my decision had been made, and I knew that this moment would mark the end of silence and the beginning of a new truth in our home. I was ready. The day came quietly, without fanfare, but with a sense of purpose I could not ignore. I knew the moment I had been preparing for had arrived. It was a family gathering, the perfect setting I had chosen after careful thought. Everyone was there, my son, my wife, children, even neighbors I had known for years. The air was thick with normal conversation, laughter, and the comfort of familiarity, but underneath it all, there was tension I could feel in my chest. I carried my folder carefully, the papers inside representing more than legal proof. They held years of my life, my sweat, my pride, and my dignity. When the moment seemed right, I stood quietly. No loud voice, no dramatic gesture, just a calm presence that drew their attention. Conversations slowed, eyes turned toward me. My son, with his usual confident smirk, looked curious but ready to dismiss whatever I was about to say. My wife glanced at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and indifference, unaware of the depth of my preparation. I placed the folder carefully on the table in front of us. The sound of the papers sliding across the surface seemed louder than any words I could have spoken. I took a slow breath and simply said, "This is my house." My voice was calm, steady, without anger, without accusation. I did not shout. I did not demand attention. I let those words hang in the air, allowing the silence to grow around them. It was the pause after my statement that mattered most. Silence is powerful. Silence forces people to listen, to think, to reflect. That moment of quiet was my plan unfolding, letting truth speak without interference. I opened the folder slowly, laying the documents and photographs one by one across the table. Each piece was deliberate. The house ownership papers came first. I let them rest there, visible to all. These were official documents, stamped and signed, showing my name, the date of ownership, and the legal right I had to the home we lived in. My wife's eyes narrowed slightly. My son looked away briefly, and the others leaned in, curiosity replacing conversation. I could feel the shift in the room. The laughter and chatter had ceased. Next, I placed the photographs. They showed me during the building of the house, hands calloused, clothes worn, sweat dripping. I made no comment. The images spoke for themselves. They told of years of sacrifice, of evenings spent in labor while the rest of the family slept. They told of a dream I had built, brick by brick, of a home meant to shelter love and family. My statement was simple. These were not just pictures. They were proof. Proof that the house was more than property. It was a life lived in dedication. I then laid down the written statement I had prepared. It was concise, but heartfelt. It detailed the history of the home, my hard work, and the meaning the house held for me. It spoke of the nights I had worked late, the money I had saved, the dreams I had built. It spoke of the respect I expected from a family I had given everything to. I did not read it aloud. I let them read it themselves, allowing the words to reach them in their own time. My silence was deliberate. My presence was my voice. The reaction was subtle at first. My son shifted uncomfortably, glancing at my wife, searching for support. My wife looked down, avoiding eye contact, perhaps sensing that what I had presented could not be denied. Neighbors leaned closer, whispers filling the air as they read the documents. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only quiet recognition. I had achieved what I wanted. The truth was now undeniable, and it rested in plain sight before them. I did not add more words. My plan was to let them process it in silence. I knew any further explanation could dilute the moment. This was not about winning an argument in noise. It was about planting the seed of truth deep in their minds. Silence after truth is like water after drought. It nourishes reflection. The room was heavy with it now. Even my son, usually quick to mock, was quiet. Even my wife's laughter had disappeared. The weight of evidence was upon them. Then I simply stood up. I looked around the table once, letting my gaze rest on each face. I said nothing more. I knew the truth I had laid before them was enough. My act of calm revelation had done more than I could have expected. It had shifted the atmosphere, transformed the gathering from a place of casual conversation to a space of recognition. They had been presented with undeniable proof, and there was no way to dismiss it without admitting fault. As I walked away from the table, I felt no anger. There was no need for confrontation now. My point had been made. I had spoken my truth without raising my voice, without stooping to the level of shouting or bitterness. The plan had worked. Respect was returning, not through force, but through quiet revelation. That was the lesson I had intended to give them all along. Respect is earned, not demanded. Later, in the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house changed. My son avoided arguments. My wife treated me with a quiet respect she had not shown before. Relatives who had been present spoke privately, acknowledging my courage in presenting the truth so calmly. The laughter that once filled the house had been replaced with a respectful hush, a recognition of what had been proven. My plan had not only reclaimed my voice, it had restored dignity to the home. In that moment, I learned something important. True strength does not come from loud words or forceful actions. True strength comes from quiet conviction, from preparation, from letting truth speak louder than anger. My plan had succeeded because it was built on patience, evidence, and calmness. I had not sought revenge. I had sought clarity. I had not shouted to be heard. I had shown so they could see. Now, as I look back, I understand that paragraph 8 was not merely a moment in a family argument. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of patience, of quiet determination. It was the moment when truth became undeniable and respect was restored. That evening was not about winning a fight. It was about teaching a lesson without raising a voice. It was about showing that dignity comes not from shouting louder, but from living with quiet integrity. And so I walked away, leaving the papers on the table. I left the room without a word, letting silence be the loudest truth of all. That was my plan. Simple, deliberate, and unforgettable. After I revealed the truth with those papers, the house fell into a kind of heavy silence that I had never heard before. It was not the normal quiet that comes with routine. It was different. It was the silence of shock, of shame, of realization. My son, who had been quick to mock and dismiss me in the past, now sat with his head lowered, avoiding my gaze. His wife, who had laughed so freely at my expense, sat stiffly, her smile gone. I could see the change in her eyes, a mixture of guilt, surprise, and unease. The atmosphere in the room shifted, as if an invisible weight had been placed upon us all. I could feel the neighbors' eyes on us through the windows. They had come to know the tension in our house long before this moment, but now they sensed something had changed irrevocably. Whispers began to travel softly from room to room. Those who were not present at the gathering heard the echo of my revelation. The silence in our home was now replaced with whispers in the street. a quiet buzz of curiosity and respect. What had been a private argument had turned into something that touched everyone who knew us. Inside the house, the change was immediate. My son no longer spoke to me in the same way. He avoided confrontation, his words clipped and careful when they did come. The arrogance he once carried in his voice was replaced by a hesitant tone that told me he now respected, or at least feared, the quiet force I had demonstrated. My wife, too, treated me differently. She no longer dismissed my presence or my opinions. Instead, there was a quiet regard, almost a recognition of what I had fought for. It was not spoken, but it was clear. The neighbors began to speak differently to me as well. In the days that followed, several of them approached quietly, offering words of support and acknowledgement. "You showed him," one said softly. "You taught him something," another whispered. It became clear that my act of quiet revelation had not only changed my home, but had also left a lasting impression on those who watched. My point had been made without confrontation, without shouting, but with undeniable truth. That was my silent victory. At the same time, I knew that my son and wife were processing more than just facts. They were processing feelings of shame, betrayal, and regret. I had not sought to humiliate them, but the truth carried its own power. It stripped away arrogance and replaced it with reflection. I watched as my son began to retreat into himself, as if realizing the weight of what he had done. My wife grew quieter, avoiding arguments, and I sensed that she was quietly reconsidering her stance in our relationship. My calm approach had forced them both to face a reality they had been avoiding. In the weeks that followed, there were small but significant changes. My son began to treat me with more respect. He no longer dismissed my words or my presence. Conversations became quieter, more thoughtful. The house felt different, not because it had changed physically, but because the balance of respect within it had shifted. My revelation had altered the dynamic of our family. It was no longer about control or argument. It was about acknowledgement and truth. The change extended beyond my immediate family. Relatives who had once avoided speaking about the matter now came to me privately, expressing admiration for my restraint. "You showed strength," one cousin said quietly. "You proved that patience and truth matter," another added. Even neighbors who had not been involved began to speak of my action with respect. It became clear that the lesson I had given was not confined to our house. It had rippled outward, touching lives beyond mine. Still, I knew the fallout was not complete. Respect, once lost, takes time to rebuild. My son and wife had to live with the truth I had presented every day. My act had planted seeds that would grow slowly. They would remember that moment, the quiet revelation, for the rest of their lives. They would remember that respect is not given freely, but earned, and that truth carries more weight than anger. I had given them a lesson that could not be undone. In the quiet of my own room, I reflected on what had happened. I realized that the fallout was not a punishment. It was a transformation. The silence that followed my revelation was not empty. It was filled with the understanding of what had been lost and what could be regained. I felt no bitterness, only a deep sense of peace. My voice had been heard without shouting, my truth accepted without a fight. That was my real victory. Over time, my relationship with my son and wife evolved. While there were still moments of tension, there was also a newfound respect. They treated me with a quiet dignity they had not shown before. I did not need them to apologize openly. Their changed behavior was enough. They understood that I had spoken without anger, without demand, and that the strength of my actions lay in their quiet truth. In that season of our lives, the fallout became a foundation for something new. The family began to rebuild itself on a different basis, one of mutual acknowledgement rather than dominance. My son began to listen more. My wife spoke less harshly. Even the neighbors seemed to carry a quieter respect when they passed our home. I had given them a gift, not of confrontation, but of truth and dignity. Looking back, I see that paragraph 9, the fallout, was more than just the result of a single act. It was the continuation of a journey I had been on for years. It was proof that truth and patience could transform even the deepest wounds. It showed me that respect is not something that can be demanded in the moment, but something that grows quietly in the wake of honesty. My revelation had changed more than a conversation. It had changed lives. And so, I walked forward knowing that the lesson had been delivered. The fallout was complete, not in anger, but in understanding. I had spoken my truth, and the silence that followed became the loudest answer. That was the power of quiet revelation, a lesson that would stay with my family forever. After the silence of the fallout settled, I walked away calmly, not because I had given up, but because I had delivered the lesson I wanted to teach. There was no need for noise, no need for more arguments, no need for a battle of words. My truth had been spoken, and the echo of it had done its work. I felt an inner peace that came from knowing I had stood for something greater than pride. I had stood for dignity and respect. That peace was not loud or obvious, but quiet and deep, like the stillness after a storm. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting often on what had happened in our living room that afternoon. The papers I had placed on the table had not just been sheets of legal proof. They had been symbols of my life's work, my commitment to my family, and my belief in fairness. That moment, and the silence that followed it, became a turning point. I felt a release, as if a heavy weight I had carried for years had finally been set down. My peace was born from the knowledge that I had not acted out of vengeance, but out of principle. I began to move through the house differently. The walls seemed to carry a different energy now. There was no longer the tension of unspoken arguments lurking in every room. Even my son and his wife treated the house with a changed attitude. They spoke less loudly, their conversations softer, as if they were aware that they had crossed a line they could not easily return from. I did not need them to apologize outright. Their silence, their careful respect, was enough to show me they had understood. That was my peace, the knowledge that the lesson had been absorbed without me forcing it. At night, I would sit in my chair by the window and think about what respect truly meant. It was not simply about obedience or agreement. It was about seeing each other as equals and honoring the efforts and sacrifices that had gone into building something together. My peace grew from the certainty that I had reminded them of this truth without raising my voice. I had not sought to humiliate, but to remind. That reminder had taken root quietly, and the peace I felt was the reward for having spoken it calmly and clearly. This peace extended beyond my own home. In the days that followed, neighbors began to speak differently to me. They greeted me with a quiet nod, as if acknowledging the weight of what had happened. There were no grand proclamations or public declarations, but a subtle shift in how I was seen in my community. People respected the fact that I had chosen truth over conflict, patience over anger. I began to see my peace reflected in the small acts of courtesy and consideration that began to return to my life. That was a gift I had not expected. I also noticed a change within myself. I no longer carried the bitterness that had once lingered under my skin. The confrontation, though painful, had cleared something inside me. My peace was not simply about the absence of conflict. It was about the presence of understanding. I had let go of the need to prove myself through loud words or angry confrontations. Instead, I had shown strength through quiet action. That was a victory deeper than any argument could have given me. The days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the house shifted further. There was less tension, less hostility. Conversations became calmer, more respectful. My son began to consult me on small matters, listening more carefully to what I said. My wife no longer dismissed my opinions. It was as if the revelation and the fallout had reset something in our family dynamic. That reset brought me peace. I knew that the truth I had spoken had not been forgotten. It had changed the way we lived together. In those quiet moments, I began to see peace as more than just a feeling. It was a state of being. It was the result of having faced betrayal with dignity and having responded not with anger, but with integrity. My peace came from knowing I had acted in a way that reflected who I was, not who my enemies thought I was. I had chosen a path that preserved my honor, even when others had tried to strip it away. That was the deepest peace of all. I began to speak about peace more openly, quietly sharing my thoughts with those willing to listen. To my surprise, some of my neighbors and relatives began to tell me that they had learned from my example. They spoke of how my calm approach had taught them something about patience and truth. That, too, gave me peace. The knowledge that my experience could inspire others. It made the weight of the fallout feel lighter, as if my peace was spreading quietly to those around me. Even my son, though he did not speak of it openly, began to show signs of change. His manner softened when he spoke to me. There were fewer sharp words and fewer dismissals. I could see that the lesson had taken root in him, even if he was not ready to admit it. That silent transformation was perhaps the most powerful confirmation of my peace. It meant that my actions had not only preserved my dignity, but had planted a seed of respect in another heart. And so, I walked forward with that peace firmly in place. I did not need the applause of others. I did not need the recognition of victory. My peace was quiet, deep, and lasting. It was the result of having faced betrayal with dignity, having spoken truth without anger, and having let silence speak louder than any argument. That peace became my legacy, the thing I would carry with me into my final days. Now, as an old man, I tell this story not with bitterness, but with calm pride. I know that my peace was born in the silence after truth was spoken. It was built on years of patience, sacrifice, and the quiet resolve to stand for what was right. My peace was the reward for speaking without anger and for letting the power of truth do its work. The lesson I leave is simple. Peace is not found in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of truth and dignity. My peace was won quietly, without confrontation, without shouting, and without bitterness. That is why I can say today that the loudest victory I have ever had came not from words, but from the quiet peace that followed them. Now, as an old man, I tell this story not to boast, but to remind myself and others of what truly matters in life. I speak calmly because the years have taught me that anger solves nothing. Respect is not demanded, it is earned quietly. I have learned that words spoken in rage are soon forgotten, but truths spoken in peace last forever. My story is my truth, and I tell it without bitterness because I have lived through the hurt, the betrayal, and the silence that followed. It is this silence that taught me the deepest lessons. I reflect on the day my son shouted, "Don't argue with my wife in her house," as if those words could erase decades of my life's work. I remember feeling shocked and betrayed, but also strangely certain that something deeper had shifted inside me. That moment became the spark that led to a quiet but powerful resolve. I did not rush to respond. I let the words settle in my mind. I watched my son and wife, studied their reactions, and understood that they were blind to the value of respect. That understanding became the root of my peace. I have thought a great deal about what respect means, and I believe it is far more than a polite gesture. Respect is the recognition of another's life, effort, and sacrifice. It is the acknowledgement of the foundation upon which our lives are built. My peace today comes from knowing I stood for respect without lowering myself to anger or humiliation. I proved without shouting that my voice mattered and that my home, my life's work, deserved to be honored. That was the heart of my quiet victory. In telling this story now, I hope to share that peace with others. Life will bring conflicts, betrayals, and moments when our dignity feels challenged. In those times, I have learned that the loudest voice is not always the most powerful. Quiet, steady truth carries a weight far greater than anger. My peace came from choosing silence over shouting, proof over argument, and patience over confrontation. That is the lesson I wish to pass on. Respect is earned through truth, and peace is earned through patience. I think often about how my actions affected my son. I do not know if he fully understands the lesson yet, but I see changes in him. He no longer speaks sharply when he sees me. There is a hesitation in his voice, a carefulness in his manner that tells me he has reflected on what happened. My wife, too, treats me differently. She does not speak of the incident, but her manner is quieter, her respect more evident. These small changes remind me that peace is not a moment, but a process that unfolds over time. My reflection leads me to consider the value of family and the fragility of relationships. We often take for granted the bonds we share until they are tested. In that testing, the true character of a person is revealed. I learned that my own character was built on patience and quiet resolve. My peace comes from knowing I did not betray myself in those moments of trial. I stood firm, not through force, but through integrity. That is the peace I have carried into my old age. I have also come to see that peace is a choice. It is not something that simply happens. It is something we create. I could have chosen to yell back, to fight, to humiliate. But I chose silence and proof. I chose a path that preserved my dignity and taught a lesson without destroying relationships. That choice has shaped who I am today. My peace is the result of deliberate decisions made in the face of betrayal. It is my answer to anger and my gift to myself and those around me. In quiet moments, I return to that day in my mind. I imagine standing in my home, papers on the table, and the hush that followed. I see my son's face, pale and silent, and my wife's eyes, lowered in quiet shame. I remember feeling a deep stillness inside, a calm that came from knowing I had spoken the truth without bitterness. That stillness became my peace. I have carried it ever since. Now, as I share this story, I am aware that peace is more than the absence of conflict. It is the presence of understanding, respect, and truth. My peace is a reflection of my life's choices. It is the reward for standing quietly for what is right. I tell this story not for myself alone, but so that others might learn that the strongest voice is often the quietest, that peace can come from stillness and respect can be restored without raising one's voice. My final thought is this: life will always present moments when our dignity is challenged. We cannot control the actions of others, but we can control how we respond. I chose peace, and in doing so, I found a victory that no argument could have given me. My peace was not won in the heat of battle, but in the quiet aftermath. It is a peace that I carry now, in my last years, as a man who has learned that respect is the true foundation of a home, and silence is sometimes the loudest answer of all. They shouted it was her house. I showed them it was mine, without raising my voice. That is my peace. That is my lesson. That is my legacy.